Welcome to Appeal to Rights in the context of ethics. This is one of the moral methods that can serve as a template for making a moral argument. Now, today, many people believe in rights, legal rights, moral rights, etc. Now, it's often accepted that people have rights that protect them from mistreatment and even entitle them to certain things known as entitlements. And it's generally accepted, at least when people are talking, that such rights must be respected under most conditions. So, from a moral standpoint, this method involves assessing something, an action, policy, etc., in terms of whether it is in accord with a particular moral right or not. Philosophically speaking, the basis of this method is typically, and kind of obviously enough, based on what's known as rights theory, at least moral rights theory, developed by folks like our good dead friend John Locke, and also, in a rather different way, our good dead friend Thomas Hobbes. Now, rights theory, at least in the case of ethics, is the view that people, and perhaps other beings, have moral rights. And the foundation for this varies quite a bit, as we'll see when we look at various moral theories. John Locke, for example, appeals to natural rights, which he ultimately bases on God. So, while right theories do have a lot of appeal, especially today thanks to the long-term influence of thinkers like John Locke, thanks to the influence of the United States, the United Kingdom, etc., these moral theories, like any moral theory, is subject to a great deal of debate and dispute. Not everyone agrees that people have moral rights, and even people who do believe in moral rights disagree about what they are, how they work, how they're applied, etc. Now, it is also important to keep in mind that moral rights are distinct from legal rights, and other types of rights as well. So, legal rights are ones that exist within a system of law, and they can be spelled out in the legal system. And the foundation for those, to be very pragmatic about it, is simply that people make that stuff up, unless you want to argue that behind the legal rights are other foundations. Now, it is possible, of course, to go from moral rights to legal rights, and even perhaps from legal rights to moral rights, and this will be discussed in the next moral method known as mixing norms, which allows you to move between various normative areas such as law and ethics. So there are actually two methods to appeal to rights. Method one, put informally, works this way. What you do is you'd argue for a right. You'd argue that something either violates or doesn't violate a right, and then conclude that it's not acceptable, like if it violates that right, or is acceptable if it's in accord with that right. More formally, and these formal steps are the type of things that one would do, as a philosopher, if you wanted to be really clear step by step. And typically in normal everyday life, in formal argumentation, people usually don't bother to lay out their steps. So the first step in method one is to argue for a particular right. This could be, say, a right to free speech. It could be right to bodily autonomy. It could be a right to privacy, whatever moral right you want to argue for. Then you'd apply that right to a particular thing you're concerned with and try to show through argument that this thing violates that right or doesn't violate it, that it's at least consistent with it. For example, in the case of, say, bodily autonomy, you might be discussing the laws, this would be doing a moral assessment of the laws for, say, restricting abortion. Or in the case of bodily autonomy, you might also look at, say, mandates to get vaccinated, looking at, say, the right to make medical decisions for yourself, and to the extent to which those rights extend. And then you'd argue that, for example, a vaccine mandate either violates or doesn't violate the right to bodily autonomy. and then you draw the appropriate conclusion based on your arguments. Now, looked at in somewhat more detail, you can argue that something is immoral or that something is moral. And so the argument, put very simply, and you need to fill in like all the parts, but if you want to argue that something is immoral, here's kind of a three-step argument for doing it. The first step is claiming, and hopefully this is something you've established in an earlier argument, that something is a moral right. Take, for example, bodily autonomy, having the freedom to decide, what is done to and with your body. The second premise is you would contend that something violates that right. And again, hopefully this would be established like in an earlier argument. For example, if you wanted to argue against, say, vaccine mandates, you could make the argument that a vaccine mandate violates the right to bodily autonomy. Or if you wanted to make an argument, say, against the laws restricting abortion, that those laws violate bodily autonomy. And then you draw the appropriate conclusion that if something is a moral right and it is violated by some policy, procedure, or action, that would not be morally acceptable. Now, if you want to do the opposite and argue that something is morally acceptable, you would begin by contending or asserting that R is a moral right. Again, it could be something like privacy, bodily autonomy, free expression, whatever right you're concerned with. And then in the second premise, you would assert, hopefully based on an earlier argument, that X does not violate that particular right. So, as the example of bodily autonomy, you might have advanced an argument that a vaccine mandate does not violate the right of bodily autonomy, and that the state would have the moral right to impose such a mandate. And again, the hard work is showing that this, say, does not violate this right. And then if something doesn't violate a right, then it would be considered morally acceptable, at least in that particular context of rights. And so the general kind of assumption here is violating a right is wrong, and something that doesn't violate a right is at least acceptable. May not be good, but is at least morally tolerable. Now, the second version of this method switches from trying to argue that something is acceptable or unacceptable to attempt to argue that something is obligatory. That is to say that it's required. Often, entitlements are often argued in this way. An entitlement is something, well, as the name implies, that you're entitled to, and if you have a right to an entitlement, then it must be provided to you. So the first step is to argue for there being a particular right that requires something. And then you argue that a particular thing is required by that right. Therefore, you conclude that it's obligatory, that one must have that or have that provided. As an example, one might contend that people have a moral right to health care. And this health care, thus, providing health care would be required by this right, perhaps by the state. And then you conclude that the state has a moral obligation to provide this. So the argument form with two premises and a conclusion would be, straightforward. The first premise would involve presenting that something is a moral right. And again, hopefully this has been supported before with a separate argument. Then premise 2, you would reference that a particular thing is required by that right, hopefully again supported by an earlier argument, and then conclude that because it's required by a moral right, that it's morally obligatory. And so debates about, say, for example, morally, what society must provide, say a minimum wage, say a universal basic income, say healthcare, say the right to vote, etc. These things would be seen as obligatory, things that must be provided. Now, again, to emphasize, we need to distinguish between legal stuff, like what is, say, legally required in terms of healthcare, what is legally required in terms of the right to vote, versus the moral obligations that might or might not exist. So those are the two methods. Again, the first method focuses on saying that something is either wrong or that it is acceptable or at least tolerable. And the second one is arguing for obligations, things that must, be provided. Now, for some examples, rights that people, not surprisingly, tend to debate about quite a bit would be, we could have an argument, something like about censorship, which is generally, as a moral subject as opposed to a legal subject, is one that often involves battles over rights. And so when people argue for censorship, going back to our good dead friend Plato, it has often been proposed to protect people from the alleged harms of violent and sexually explicit media. And the usual counter to that, to argue that this censorship is wrong and should not be allowed, is to argue for a right to a freedom of expression. Or alternatively, which is often kind of forgotten, not just a right of expression, but also a right of consumption. That people have a right to express their views, but you also have a right to, view such things, or hear them, etc. And so the way to argue against censorship, to argue that it's wrong, going back to the first method, would be appealing to a right of freedom of expression or a right of freedom of consumption. Another example that's very politically charged is bodily autonomy, the freedom to make decisions about your own body. And one common debate here used to be over something like birth control. And at one point this was separate issue, but this was illegal in the United States. And there is still a moral debate somewhat about birth control. So do people have a right to choose when they do or do not get pregnant? Similarly, of course, the debate over abortion is often cast in terms of a right of bodily autonomy. Again, the right to decide when one gets pregnant and whether one is going to carry through on a pregnancy. In the debates over vaccines, there's been an attempt to use the bodily autonomy notion right to argue against vaccine mandates. The argument being that it's your body, your choice, and they're lifting language directly from the abortion debate. The idea being that you would have a moral right to refuse getting vaccinated because you have a right to control your body. And as you might imagine, there's a great deal of debate over something as contentious as bodily autonomy. How far does it extend? And people also, of course, bring in concerns about how it impacts others. Some considerations about this method. Now, as I noted through the methods, generally, if you want to make a good argument appeal to rights, you need to give the audience a reason, an argument that supports that right. So if someone just simply says, a right of, privacy, right of free expression, right of bodily autonomy, and gives no reason to accept that as plausible, then the argument would be fairly weak because it hinges on the right being something that is plausible or believable. Now, in order to argue that a right should be accepted, you might end up using some other moral method. And another way to use it, of course, would be the moral method of the either moral principle or appeal to a moral theory. Unfortunately, if you want to argue about rights, there has been centuries of philosophers putting down the groundwork for you. Like our good dead friend John Locke laid out very explicitly a theory of rights to life, liberty, and property. And there are many other theorists who've argued for it as well. It's a very popular concept in ethics. And of course, there's been strong opposition throughout the centuries, so you can find people who argue against rights as well. Now, speaking of arguing against rights, there are ways to respond to and appeal to rights. This could be done, say, in the context of your paper, where you use appeal to rights to make an argument for your position. And then, of course, a very reasonable way to argue against appeal to rights is obviously to counter one of these approaches. And of course, you might also be doing a paper where you go after rights as your position, that you're criticizing the particular right or an application of it. And of course, outside of the paper, people argue, about rights quite a bit. And so it's good to know how to respond to an appeal to rights. Now, one approach is, obviously enough, to attack the right itself, to argue either that there is no such right in question, or to argue that although there is such a right, that it's being incorrectly applied. And if this attack is successful, then the argument is obviously undercut, because if there is no such right, then it can't be used. Or if it's being applied incorrectly, then obviously the argument would be flawed. Now, the type of attack would vary depending on the right in question and the circumstances of the argument. So it might be argued that the right is not a legitimate right. To use kind of a extreme and perhaps even silly example, but in a way it's not silly because you see this happening for real. People do sometimes contend that they have a right to do anything they want with their body. Now, they're obviously not really thinking it through, because there doesn't seem to really be like a right to do anything you want with your body, because if that were true, that would mean, to take it to the, kind of absurd extreme, that would mean that you could murder people, kill people, because you have a right to do anything you want with your body, so killing people would be okay. And to be even more absurd, then a person would have a right to infect themselves with an incredibly contagious, deadly disease, and then just run around in public, or do other horrible things. Again, probably they're not really, probably, I hope, serious when they say they have a right to do anything they want with their body. They're probably just, being rhetorically, engaging in a bit of hyperbole, and they probably, one hopes, don't really mean that. But then again, maybe people do. More seriously, you can criticize pretty much any right because there are arguments against them. Rights to privacy, right to free expression, etc. Those can be countered. Not everyone believes that there are such rights, and you can raise arguments against them. And of course, you can also argue that even though there, say, perhaps is a right, that a more important right overrides it. For example, to use a practical everyday example, I have a right to do with my truck, pretty much as I wish in terms of maintaining it, etc. But other people on the road have a right not to be killed by me. And so that requires me to limit what I do with my truck. So for example, if I want to repaint it a different color, sure, I got a right to do that. That's no problem. But if I want to, say, remove the brakes from my truck and drive without brakes, then that would seem to be overridden by the right of other people not to be seriously injured by my bad choices. And so you could argue that people do have a right, but other rights override it. As another example, to get contentious, think about the debate over the vaccine and the right to choose. Now, a person can make an argument about bodily autonomy. I have the right not to get injected with medications, the right to refuse that. However, if my failure to do so would put other people at risk, that I become a vector for, a virus, and perhaps even worse, that I would become essentially a natural laboratory where the virus can mutate and become, worse, more dangerous, or resistant to vaccines, then my right to not get the vaccination could be overridden by the rights of other people to not be exposed to a plague beast in their midst. And again, this comes down to a debate over rights. So one way to attack the right is to argue there is no such right, which is an option. Another approach is to argue that there's a more important right that overrides the right. And this battle stays within the realms of rights. Now, you can also move outside the realm of debating rights to applying other methods. Now, one very commonly used counter method when debating rights, both in the context of philosophy and out in the wild, is to look at an appeal to consequences, another one of our methods. And so one way to counter a right is to argue that the consequences of allowing the right morally actually override it, that you can justify, violating that right because of very bad consequences, or perhaps very good consequences. For example, consider the case of censorship. Now, in the United States, in general, we accept that people have a right to free expression. And in the law, it's laid out in the First Amendment. But there's also the separate moral right to free exception we just tend to kind of assume. Now, it is also generally accepted that this right, like any other right, is not absolute. For example, people don't have the right to morally slander other people, to tell harmful untruths. Another example would be the classic case, of course, of a person yelling fire in a crowded theater that's not on fire. Or a person on an airplane yelling out, about a bomb. Although we believe in free expression, many of us do, those are considered sort of paradigm exceptions. That even if you do have a right to free expression, a person doesn't have a moral right to slander and hurt others with their lies. They don't have a right to scream fire in a crowded theater, and various other examples. And again, this can all be debated. I mean, someone could argue you should be able to shout anything you want and slander people and lie, etc. That, of course, can be debated. But appeals to consequences are pretty common. As another example, again, torn from today's headlines, again, consider the debate over vaccine mandates. And one could agree that there is a right to bodily autonomy, that you have a moral right to decide what medical, treatments and procedures that you get, and that you would have a moral right of refusal. However, one can make an appeal to consequences to override that right. Just like, to use a moral analogy, just like I don't have a right to take the brakes off my truck because while that could hurt me, which would be on me, I could also seriously hurt other people. And so one could argue that the consequences of not getting vaccinated would make it acceptable to violate that right, to compel people to get vaccinated, because failure to do so would be so dangerous and harmful to others. And this comes down to, essentially a battle over individual rights versus, say, causing a lot of harm to other people. And one can argue in favor of individual rights even when it hurts a lot of people. There are people who clearly think that is not only okay, but a good thing. So appeal to consequences is an effective way to argue about overriding a right. And again, the method essentially is showing that the consequences of allowing that right to be exercised in that context would be so harmful that the right should be overridden. Another counter method is an appeal to rules. And the appeal to rules method basically is that there are moral rules and that breaking these rules is wrong, following them is right. And so the way to counter an appeal to rights with an appeal to rules is to show that there is a rule that either overrides the right or simply nullifies that right. Or perhaps, as essentially, if you want to really be thorough, that you essentially wipe out the whole appeals to rights thing, saying morality is about rules. For example, like not an extreme version, but kind of a more modest version. Thanks to folks like John Locke, it's often believed that people have a moral right to life, liberty, and property. However, even in Locke, people can be justly deprived of them by a rule of due punishment. So in this case, the rule that if someone engages in appropriate misdeeds, they can be denied their rights. And of course, switching to law, that is typically codified in law, which lays out legally the rules for removing people's legal rights, or at least, acting in apparent violation of them. And of course, those are just two examples: appeal to consequences, appeal to rules, and various other methods, of course, can be used as well. The whole idea being trying to, generically speaking, without going through every single possibility, obviously, is that you can provide an alternative assessment, essentially arguing that the appeal to rights is not the best way to approach this. Here's some other approach to counter it. Now, since the paper is you give your position, argue for your position, raise an objection, reply, you could run through this cycle. So if you're using an appeal to rights to argue that something is, morally acceptable, then you would use kind of attack against that, and then counter that attack, argue against the argument against. If you are arguing that something, is wrong and violates the rights, you would, attack that, and then counter that, and then return to your original position. So that's a look at the appeal to rights and how to criticize it. And it's a fairly useful and common method. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.